To speak more about that and about the spectrum allocation, which the president also mentioned in his State of the Nation address, we're joined by Duncan McLeod. He's the editor of TechCentral.com. Duncan, thanks a lot for your time. We appreciate it. Let's start off with the basics. Why it's important for that analog to digital switch to happen. What does that mean for the telecommunications industry?
Good morning. This is really not so much about television broadcasters, although it will lead to more competition in the broadcasting industry. What this was really about is freeing up spectrum that's called the digital dividend. These are bands that have been used historically by the SABC and ETV to broadcast analog signals in South Africa. And the digital migration project is really about getting those analog broadcasters out of those bands so that the bands can be reallocated through a spectrum auction, which eNCA, the communications regulator, is running, so that those bands can be used for mobile broadband services for rolling out 4G, better 4G coverage, and eventually 5G as well.
The president bemoaning how long it's taken for that migration to take place. What's the holdup been?
There's been plenty of reasons for this holdup, which has been going on for a very, very long time. It was, in fact, under the Thabo Mbeki administration, when Ivy Matsepe-Cassaburi was still the communications minister, that the government promised that this project would be done by December 2010. So we're 12 years beyond the original deadline. We had also promised to the International Telecommunication Union, which is part of the United Nations, that we would finish the project by mid-2015. That deadline also came and went. I think the principal reason for this is in short, government bungling, and the fact that under the Jacob Zuma administration, we basically had a new communications minister every year who had to get up to speed with what was going on in the sector. There was also a lot of fighting between vested commercial interests about whether or not there should be encryption in the set-top boxes that the government was subsidizing for poorer households, and that also delayed the process by a number of years. But there's a multitude of factors that has resulted in South Africa being one of the last countries, certainly amongst more developed nations, to complete the switch off. Most countries across Europe, Asia, and North America have already completed digital migration.
Speaking of delays, Duncan, the spectrum auction. The president says it's going to happen in about 3 weeks' time, but it's still the subject of a court process. Telkom is taking eNCA to court, and that hearing is going to happen after the auction. Is it still the prudent thing to do to have the spectrum auction in 3 weeks' time if whatever happens in court might actually undo the work of the auction?
Yeah, I think the president put on a very brave face during his State of the Nation address last night. He didn't make any reference to the two pieces of litigation that are currently before the courts that could in fact derail this entire process by a period of another 15 to 24 months. We know that Telkom, which ironically is 40% owned by the state, is challenging eNCA. In fact, the minister is an opponent in that court case. Telkom is unhappy with various aspects of the invitation to apply to participate in the spectrum auction, and the merits of that case are going to be heard in the second week in April, which is about a month after eNCA is supposed to conclude the spectrum auction. Now, the president drawing a firm line in the sand here, saying the spectrum auction is going to go ahead in a few weeks' time. So I guess it will go ahead, but the big question then becomes, well, what happens if Telkom wins in the second week of April? Does that mean that Telkom then has to, or eNCA rather, then has to say, sorry, chaps, we need to take the spectrum back from you because we need to redo this process? I think if Telkom wins, we're going to see at least an 18-month delay in the actual allocation of that spectrum to operators. And of course, there is then the interrelated case brought by eMedia Holdings, which is the parent of this television channel and of ETV, that is suing the communications minister because it's unhappy that with the speed at which government is moving to get the digital migration project done, saying that the set-top boxes are not in people's hands yet, particularly poorer households, and that this will have a negative commercial impact on ETV, and eMedia Holdings is seeking to have the process delayed. So there's a twin set of litigation going on here, and a very real risk, which the president did not address in his speech last night, that this process could once again be derailed.
It's a tangled web, Duncan. Litigation flying left, right, and center. Let's talk money. How much will go into the government's coffers when this spectrum auction does finally go ahead? And how much will it boost productivity in the country and help GDP?
We're probably looking at about 8 to 10 billion rand in revenue for the national fiscus, which sounds like a lot of money at face value, but when you consider the size of the national debt, it's actually a drop in the ocean. It's more important. The bigger impact here is going to be the potential impact that getting broadband prices down and getting broadband into the hands of more consumers in South Africa will have on economic growth. There's been study after study, including by the World Bank and many others, that show that there is a direct correlation between internet penetration and specifically broadband penetration and GDP growth. It's been shown time and again in countries that have rolled out infrastructure, got spectrum and spectrum to operators and broadband into consumers' hands, that there is a direct correlation. So getting this process done is absolutely imperative, and the president is absolutely right to be pushing so hard to get this through, despite the litigation risks that we see at the moment. I think under President Zuma, this process was allowed to languish for far too long, given its economic importance. And I think President Ramaphosa is absolutely right to be putting this at the top of his policy agenda.
All right, Duncan, thank you so much for your time. You know, this is like good reality TV. Let's see what happens in 3 weeks' time, and then let's see what happens in April when that case is in court. Duncan McLeod from TechCentral.co.za.